in terms of hearing anybody speak, or you want somebody to repeat something, just go ahead and put it in the chat, and we'll try to address any technical issues then. I'm going to pass it off to Matt to kick us off.
Sure. Well, welcome everyone to our Objective Design Standards workshop. We are going to be talking about these two things that really shouldn't go together: objectivity and design. Design is kind of inherently subjective, changes with time, changes with place. But here we are 3 years after really objective design standards were thrust into planners' laps by the legislator with the passage of SB 330 in 2019. Here we are still trying to figure it out and refine our approaches to objective design standards. So we're going to be presenting on that today, and hopefully we can have a robust discussion on what's working and what's not, and how we can continue to support you all as you address this challenging topic. So with that, let's get into it. Next slide, please. We're going to start with a brief welcome and introductions of our team. We do have a couple of Slido polls, so just a heads up, if you're on your computer and you have your phone handy, that'll be helpful. If for some reason you're on your phone, it may be a little challenging to participate in the polls. No big deal. You can always chime in via chat. But just wanted to give you a heads up that that's all coming. For those of you in the room, you can either use your laptop or get your phone out. We've got just a few questions today. So we'll start with welcome and introductions. Then we're going to have an overview of objective design standards, both a module on understanding objectivity. We have Gabrielle Janessens, I think I got that right, from Goldfarb and Lippmann, who's going to talk about some of the legal framework and understanding to set the stage on objective design standards. Then my colleague, Christine Babla, is going to be talking about some best practices. That will conclude our overview section, and then we will hear from the City of Carlsbad, who recently adopted objective design standards, both citywide and for their barrio and village area. So we'll be hearing from them about their experience, lessons learned, and takeaways from their recent adoption. And then we'll have a module after that on developing objective design standards and implementing them, different approaches you may want to consider as you're undertaking an objective design standards effort. We will pause throughout that for questions and discussion. We should have ample time to make it through all of our agenda items, so feel free to chime in to share your thoughts or ask questions, and we'll do our best to answer those while keeping things moving. So that's our plan for this afternoon. So let's go ahead and start with introductions. If we could go to the next slide. You can join our Slido poll either by taking you're holding your camera up to the QR code, or by going to slido.com. If you're going through your web browser to slido.com, there should be a button or a field to enter in that code there, 2261273, and that should take you to the poll. Right now, it's going to say no. Oh, there. Yeah, it's going to ask you, what jurisdiction are you from? We're just trying to get a sense of who's here participating today. In past regional trainings, we've gone around the room and had everyone speak. So we're trying to expedite things a little bit here by doing the poll. While you all are completing the poll, I think maybe we can do introductions for our project team and presenters here. So we'll start with the people in the room and then transition to the project team members who are going to be presenting via Zoom today. So first off, I'm Matt Geldman, and I'm with Ascent. I'm going to be helping facilitate the meeting today, and I'll pass it over to Christine, and we could just go around.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Christine Babla. I'm also with Ascent, and I'll be speaking on the standards.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Carrie Simmons. I am a SANDAG regional planner, and I'm help manage this TA program with SANDAG. And it's nice to see everybody.
Hi, I'm Veronica, also with Ascent.
You guys probably filled out the Slido. Maybe we'll skip and go to Thomas and Sarah.
Hi.
Hi everyone, my name is Thomas Frank. I'm a regional planner at SANDAG and supporting the work on the TA program.
Hello, everybody. My name is Sarah Toma. I'm the senior regional planner here at SANDAG. Looking forward to this training.
And then for our project team that is on the Zoom, I think we have Gabrielle. If you're there, Gabrielle, can you say a quick hello?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Gabrielle Janssens. I'm a partner at the law firm of Goldfarb and Lippman. And our practice involves a lot of affordable housing. And we also work with cities and counties on implementing housing-related legislation and reviewing applications and providing legal advice in that realm as well. So it's good to be here, and I look forward to chatting with all of you today.
Thank you, Gabrielle. I know we have two others on our project team, Paul Kronzer from Ascent, who's helping keeping things running on our PowerPoint and Slido. And we have Stacy Cooper from SANDAG as well. So just wanted to give a shout out for those two who I see on here. If you would like to say hello, you're welcome to, but I'm not going to make you. All right. We got a wave from Stacy. I don't know if you saw that. So thank you. I think we can go over to the next poll question real quickly. I also want to know, our question here is, what do you want to know about objective design standards? Why did you come to the training today? What questions can we answer? What are you dying to learn more about? That's what we want to hear from you all right now. While you're all thinking about that and typing in your answers, I'll just mention we're really happy to see such diverse representation from throughout the region. Many jurisdictions are represented on the call today, which is really great to see such interest in this topic. So, what do you want to know?
I'm like getting a whole.
What's the character lane? Oh, okay. That's
How to address mixed use? Do we have any good examples? Implementation. Give it a little longer here. Everything.
That's fair.
Fire mitigation exemption. Okay. Measuring effectiveness. That's a great question. How ODS impacts affordable, assuming that says affordable housing, but got cut off. Still see at least one person typing. Affordability impacts, that might be the finishing thought to that. Large jurisdiction, how do you do objective design standards? Definitely a challenge. All right. Well, with that, we can turn it over to Gabrielle, who will kick it off with understanding objectivity and talking about the legal framework and judicial interpretation for objective design standards. So we're going right into the deep end here to set the stage.
Yes, thank you, Matt. So if we're talking about objective standards, we should know what objective standards are. And the state has definitions and statutes as well as case law that courts have decided discussing objectivity. If we could go to the next slide, please. So the Housing Crisis Act, which was adopted in SB 330 and is codified in Government Code Section 66300, has a definition for objective design standards. The definition is up on the screen if you want to read it. But basically, an objective design standard involves no personal or subjective judgment. It is something that cannot require interpretation. And it needs to be uniformly known by the project applicants and the decision makers and the community as well. The Housing Accountability Act also has a very similar definition of objective standards. So if we could go to the next slide, please. All right, so a question is, well, where do we find the objective standards? They can be located in a variety of places, in your zoning code, for example, in your subdivision ordinance. They can be in your general plan, in your design guidelines or policy documents. So anything that you would be imposing on a project is a place that can contain objective standards. And objective standards under the Housing Accountability Act, and the Housing Accountability Act applies to housing development projects, which I think is the focus of our discussion. It limits the instances where a city or county can deny a project based on if they're complying with objective design standards. So if a project is in compliance with objective design standards, and I'll get into this in more detail in a minute, but the opportunities to deny the project are very limited. And same for reducing the density of projects under the Housing Accountability Act. The purpose of having objective design standards is to make the requirements predictable and easy to interpret. It does, however, remove a lot of flexibility that was, I guess that planners are accustomed to being able to work with. So it does add some challenges when you're trying to ensure a project is going to be compatible with your community. And compatible is an example of a non-objective term. Let's see, what else do I want to say on this slide? All right, let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned, the Housing Accountability Act limits the ability to deny or reduce the density of a project that complies with objective standards. There are some very narrow circumstances that a city could deny a project or reduce the density if the project is complying with objective standards. So for a housing project that does not have 20% affordability, you would need to show the specific adverse impacts on public health and safety, and that there's no way to mitigate or avoid the impact. That is a finding that would have to be made in order to reduce density or deny a project that's compliant with your objective standards. In addition to that, if the project is 20% affordable or greater, there are some additional findings that would need to be made. And these findings have to do, and I'm not going to go through all of them, there's 5 of them. But for example, you would need to deny the project to comply with state or federal law. The project is proposed for agricultural land, or there's not adequate water or sewer. The project is inconsistent with both the zoning general plan and it's not a housing element site. So these are examples of ways and findings you would have to make to reduce density if it is compliant with objective standards. Density bonus law puts a wrinkle into this objective standards, because if a project has a certain percentage of units that are affordable, they can, in addition to requesting additional density, which it's not a requirement to have additional density, there's an opportunity to request incentives and concessions and waivers from design standards. A concession is basically the project would not be able to provide the affordability, and that there would be an economic and financial burden to do so, or it would be not feasible financially to provide the affordable units. And a waiver is that physically the project would not be able to provide the density allowed and the concessions granted. Concessions a project can have 1 up to 4, depending on how much affordability it's providing. Waivers are unlimited. There is one narrow instance where waivers are not unlimited, and that's 100% affordable project that takes advantage of unlimited density and a 3-story increase in height. And those have to be within a half mile of a major transit stop to take advantage of those. So while we have the objective standards in place, a project can request to not comply with them, and a city or county's opportunity to deny that request are pretty limited. To deny a waiver, the city or county would have to make findings that it would be a violation of state law or federal law, or a specific adverse impact to health and safety or to a property listed on the California Historic Register, and that there is no satisfactory way to mitigate those impacts or to avoid them. If it's a concession, in addition to those, a finding that would need to be made is there's substantial evidence to counter the claim of reduced costs, which is going to be very difficult for a public agency to make that finding. And then lastly, on density bonus, so if a waiver or a concession is granted to make the project not have to comply with a particular objective standard, that does not then make the project inconsistent or require the project to obtain a zoning amendment or a general plan amendment. So that is something to keep in mind as well, is that even though there might be some inconsistencies now with the project because they were granted through density bonus, that is not a grounds to deny a project based on the fact that they're not consistent with objective standards. So what does this all mean for the roles of design review boards and hearings? So these requirements and limitations that are placed on public agencies and jurisdictions have to do with housing. A city and county is going to look at a lot of other types of projects. So these don't necessarily place the same limitations on, say, a commercial or industrial project, for example. So your design review board is going to have the traditional role that it's always had in that context. Additionally, the Housing Crisis Act talks about not imposing or enforcing design standards established after January 1st, 2020. But what does that mean about standards that were in place before then? So we'll talk about the Carla case a little bit later, but the court in that case did say that the Housing Accountability Act does not prevent local agencies from imposing conditions of approval. It prohibits conditions of approval that the project be developed at a lower density unless the findings are made. And in the court's opinion, nothing prevents the city from imposing appropriate conditions of approval to mitigate any effects on the height. Well, in this particular case, it had to do with the height. So there is an opportunity to provide some subjective standards in the terms of conditions of approval, so long as they don't prohibit the project from occurring or reduce the density. And then last on this slide, before we talk about a couple cases related to objective standards, has to do with how does one adopt the objective standards. So it can be done either in an ordinance or a resolution. There's a couple differences in implications with that. Adopting something by ordinance is a longer process in most jurisdictions. It requires 2 readings by the city council or board of supervisors. And then once approved, it does not go into effect for 30 days. A resolution, on the other hand, can be adopted when it is first presented to the city council or board of supervisors, and it can go into effect immediately. So those are kind of the big differences and some things to think about. A good practice for adopting design standards by resolution is to make sure that it is clear that they're implementing either the general plan or the zoning ordinance and the policies in the general plan. So that's just a food for thought. If we could go to the next slide, please. So the case of McCorkle versus City of St. Helena had to do with a project that proposed an 8-unit apartment building, and the city approved a CEQA Class 32 exemption for the project. The plaintiffs in the case argue that an EIR was required for this project. The municipal code required design review, but it limited the considerations that were in that design review that were part of the design review. And it limited to the general form, spatial relationship, and appearance of the project's proposed design. And it precluded disapproval for non-design related reasons. So when the court reviewed this, it found that the actions taken by the city were considered to be ministerial because it could not impose conditions that would have any effects on the environmental impacts, and that the design review elements were not considered environmental. So because the project was ministerial, there's nothing the city could have done to mitigate impacts, which is why it did not need an EIR. The court also talked about, and I think this is a pretty common concept under CEQA, that projects involving both discretionary and non-discretionary actions are deemed discretionary and subject to CEQA. But in this particular case, because the design review could not make any changes or impose any conditions related to environmental, it did not make sense to have an EIR. And therefore the exemption was appropriate. Let's go to the next slide, please. And so the last couple slides I'm going to talk about have to do with Carla versus City of San Mateo. Carla is I'm forgetting what it stands for. It has to do with the rental legal assistance. And this was the first major court case that interpreted the meaning of the objective standard under the Housing Accountability Act. So beyond substantial evidence, it went beyond substantial evidence and put on this requirement of the reasonable person standard, which I'll get into in a moment. And the city bears the burden of proof that a decision complies with the Housing Accountability Act. As we said earlier, if judgment is involved, then a standard is not objective. So this is basically what the case went into. And let's go to the next slide. So this is a drawing of what the proposed project was. The applicant proposed a 4-story, 10-unit apartment building in an area that was primarily single-family homes. The city staff and the consultant reviewed the project and recommended to the Planning Commission that the project was consistent with the city's objective standards. However, the Planning Commission disagreed with staff and thought that it was not consistent. The project was then appealed to the City Council, who made that same decision. So what was the standard that we were looking at? So it had to do with a step back when there was more than a 1 or 2 foot height differential between the project and the single family homes. All right, let's go to the next slide. So why was that standard not objective? Oh, and I apologize, the standard was actually written on the prior slide. Hopefully you all saw that. Yeah, so if a height varies by more than 1 story between the buildings, the transition or step back in height is necessary. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, we'll go over some questions that were raised that made it so that the standard is not objective. So one of the questions is, well, what could be a transition? Could it be trees, which is what was originally proposed? Could you have a trellis instead of a setback? Like what was intended by setback? It was also not clear how far the upper floors had to be set back. Was 1 foot sufficient? Did it have to be more than that? We don't know. The objective design standard, well, the standard, since we now know it's not objective, did not specify that. It's also not clear how far along the building it had to go. Could it be only, you know, a couple feet of the building, or did it have to be the entire length of the building? And again, not clear how many floors had to do this step back. Was it just the top floor? Was it any floor above 1 or 2 stories? And then, right, so not clear how much of a step back would be sufficient to comply with the objective. And let's go to the next slide. So the court determined that the standard is not objective if a reasonable person can reach different conclusions. And in this particular case, we saw that the staff and the planning consultant reached one conclusion about whether the project complied with the standard, and the planning commission and city council reached a different conclusion. So that right there will point us to it probably not being an objective standard. And then the court found that both of the interpretations from the city, the planning commission and the city council, and then the staff and consultant were reasonable. And so the court found that because both of those interpretations were reasonable, that was proof that the standard was not objective. So since either interpretation works, they found that the project should have been approved. Let's see. So, and then in this particular context, under the Housing Accountability Act, the court does not defer to the city's interpretation of its guidelines, and we're looking at the reasonable person standard instead. And I think that is all I have to say about this concept and the legal framework background. So I will turn it back to you all.
Thank you, Gabrielle. We're going to keep moving into best practices techniques. So if you do have questions on anything, excuse me, Gabrielle shared, we will take some questions after this best practices technique. So I'll turn it over to you, Christine.
All right, thank you. Well, that was a lot of information, and next we'll go into best practice techniques. Apologies if it's too basic or fundamental, but considering how complex the topic is and often the types of different things that we're regulating, we really do need to go back to the basics and think about how we construct the language and the guidance and these criteria. So next slide. So we like to summarize some of the basics in terms of 6 best practices. This includes using simple, clear language, using different methods for structuring the standards to have variety to regulate really the variety of topics that we are discussing, grouping similar topics together, avoiding long narratives and really being clear and concise with bullets, tables, and lists, and then using annotated graphics and other types of illustrations to show application. And then finally, testing and refining standards both through the process and subsequent to adoption. So we'll start with the first topic, next slide, which is simple, clear language. And I find this is one of the biggest transitions when you go from design guidelines to design standards, is really avoiding design speak or planner jargon or terms of art. And a lot of us in the field have used these sorts of language for a long time. So it's kind of a difficult transition to make and think about quite a lot of specificity in terms of intent. So these are some examples that we see often. Things like respond to adjacent residential uses with a sensitive transition and scale and massing, designing buildings to fit the context of their surrounding, or using something like street trees to delineate a public street. So these are all things that I think we'd have a long discussion about in terms of implementation, and that's really what we want to avoid. All right, and then in terms of simple language and clear language, it's good to go back to the differences between suggestions and requirements, and really what makes design standards different from design guidelines. Design guidelines by their nature are subjective. They are recommendations. They're not necessarily enforceable, and they really don't have the teeth of regulations. They're open to interpretation, as we've discussed, and they're difficult to really measure or verify. And then oftentimes, a key thing you might see is the use of terms such as should or may, but it can be a lot more complex than that in terms of looking for ways to verify or confirm compliance. And then comparing that to design standards by their nature are objective. They are requirements and enforceable as regulations, as code, essentially. They should be measurable and verifiable by different people with the same conclusion. And often a key part of this is the use of words such as shall, must, required to be absolutely clear the intent. Next slide. So these are some examples of the differences between guidelines and standards and how one might rewrite a subjective guideline as a standard. I won't go through all of these, but the first example, providing articulation to reduce the mass and scale of a building and again, be sensitive to the neighborhood. This is going to mean something something different for every community. So it's helpful to really understand, what does that mean? What does articulation mean? We can measure it in terms of a frequency per interval of building length. For every 100 feet of building length, there should be a plane break, and we can define a plane break as an offset and give it a dimension and also explain how far you want that plane break to extend. So really kind of going into detail becomes very helpful, and oftentimes also pairing this with a graphic just to be really sure about the intent. Some other examples, simpler, maybe transition from should to shall, or providing dimensions for things like access and walkway widths, etc. Next slide. So there are a number of different methods for structuring standards, and depending on the complexity of standards, adding these different methods can really help with interpretation, but also just make it more specific and really tailor to the situation. So you're not required to make everything quantifiable and numeric, and using this kind of variety can help avoid rigidity throughout the document. So mixing and matching techniques that could help with and give flexibility include things like true and false statements, counts and measurements, ratios, calculations, lists, scorecards, and even techniques like using benchmarks or performance measures such as LEAD or CalGreen, or looking at exceeding certain performance measures within your zoning code. Next slide. So I'll go through some examples of these methods. True-false criteria can be helpful when you don't want to use a measurement. For example, the bottom automobile and pedestrian access points shall not be gated or otherwise closed off to the public. You either have a gate or you don't. That's a true-false statement. It's very clear. Another technique is ratios, counts, and measurements. So this is where you may want a minimum value, a maximum value, some percentage, or a range. This can be helpful in this example where you're looking at a minimum compliance. So any development that includes 10 or more units shall provide a minimum of 10% of the total number of units as 3-bedroom dwelling units. It's a good use of ratio. Next slide. Lists can be very helpful when flexibility is desired, when you might be looking for creativity in terms of design, but you don't want sameness. There may be a predetermined range of acceptable solutions, materials, components. You can use the terms any of the following, at least one of the following, no more than 3 of the following. For example, this can be very helpful with things like entryways, frontages, active ground floor treatments, and you can provide any number of solutions, but a minimum goal for how creative or how rich you want that environment to be. So it could include things like awnings, stoops, patios, shade structures, change in materials, and you can include a variety and a little more detail on that, and then specify a minimum compliance. Next slide. Scorecards are very similar to the list that we just shared, but this is helpful if we are talking about things that can also be measured, such as landscape materials, where you want to get a minimum quality and maturity or size of landscaping. So and allowing some mixing and matching with a minimum point value. And then sometimes you can also give some additional credit for going above and beyond. Great. Grouping similar topics together is another important technique. And what we're trying to do here is really avoid redundancy or a lot of flipping back and forth throughout a document, trying to understand what the goals are. If you're grouping the similar topics together and you do it well, that can really help with conveying what you're looking for, but also making sure that the submittal is compliant with the standards. And then if you are providing, a comment letter, for example, you can very easily refer to these topical headers. So generally, we like to group under topical headers and really limit 4 to 6 items under each header. If you find that you just have a lot of standards, you should be looking for more topical headers, breaking down the discussion, looking at building and sub-bullets and other hierarchies so that you can simplify again interpretation. So these are some examples. Another way to accomplish this is through the use of tables. Form-based codes use this technique a lot, where they use a table and then a short narrative and some requirements that are keyed to a diagram and photos. This can really help again with interpretation. It's great to really be specific about where the requirements are, and having things like dimensions and minimums, maximums, etc. Next slide. So talking about avoiding long narratives, these are a couple of examples of different ways to structure standards. So this first example shows a page by page organization. This is a sheet from our toolkit that we developed for HCD that shows different examples. Basically, you have a one-page summary of standards, and so every topical header would have one page devoted to those standards. And at the right, you see photos and graphic examples that are tied with annotation that's tied back to the standards that's in the text. There's an example, if we can zoom in, but there's an example of different components like standards and different ways of addressing hierarchy, and then also providing some options for different solutions for flexibility again. And then with photos, it can be very helpful to show real world examples from local communities, but we can also show some examples of don'ts, like what don't you want to see, but just do that sparingly. Next slide. And then this is an alternative to what I just shared, where we could put all of the standards, for example, in a table. And this is an example of regulating open space, common open space, and private open space through the use of a table. And you can build in quite a lot of information here, where you regulate by different project sizes and types, and build in criteria as well. All right, next slide. And then number 5, we talked about annotated graphics. These can be really helpful in terms of expressing intent, just clarifying what's said in the criteria, showing the application of standards. And I think the importance here is getting that narrative and the annotation just right. So it is clear and the annotation is also objective. Next slide. And then this is another means of using graphics. Can be really helpful just to show components, for example, in a built example, and showing how things can be implemented. Again, just with local examples that people understand. Okay, next slide. And then I think this is a really important one, testing and refining your standards. We find that developing standards is a very iterative process. It can be very helpful to really test your standards in a number of ways. For example, looking at photos of desirable projects in your community, the standards that you're developing, do they comply? Are there lessons you can learn from these built examples that you would like to build into your standards? It can also be very helpful at the end to make sure that you aren't disallowing the kinds of development that you're looking for. So doing that kind of test throughout the process can be quite helpful. We also do feasibility testing often on different parcels to ensure that standards are applicable and feasible given different lot sizes, different configurations, different adjacencies. Again, we don't want to preclude the types of development that we're looking for by using standards that are too onerous. And one thing that can be very helpful is talking to your community, your development community at different stages in the process, have them review the standards, and they will give very direct feedback. I've often found that they will give very strong, refinements that can really help achieve what you're looking for. And then don't be afraid to do that throughout the process, but also come back after the standards are adopted. It can be helpful, just like you would update zoning on a periodic basis. Consider opportunities to revisit the standards after you've been living with them for a couple of years. You know, are they achieving what you're looking for? Could something be phrased different? Are you missing some standards around some key things like open space or public realm? Just going back again and making refinements. That's it.
All right, thank you, Christine. We are going to have another Slido poll here. We've got 5 questions. We've selected some standards to present to you so you can decide whether they're objective or not. Once you see the standard, you're going to have an option of very subjective, subjective, neutral, objective, or very objective, just trying to see where you land in terms of interpreting this standard. Obviously, these are cherry-picked examples taken out of context, so this isn't really meant to be a final judgment on these standards, but more just to kind of see how they fit and how different people can interpret the standards. So let's see how this goes, and I'll give you each question about 30 seconds to respond. So we'll try and move through this pretty quickly. But the standard we're presenting here is the site layout, orientation, and location of structures, buildings, and signs shall be designed to create a well-integrated relationship to one another. So very subjective, somewhat subjective, neutral or unsure, somewhat objective, or very objective. All right, we got 10 responses. I think the consensus is very subjective, with some people saying somewhat subjective or somewhat objective. All right. I think we can move on to the next one. Buildings should be compatible with the scale of the neighborhood. If height varies by more than 1 story between buildings, a transition or step in height is necessary. All right, this one should look familiar. This is the standard from the Carla case. So the court ruled that it's subjective. So yeah, this was all about the transition. What is a transition, and do you need a step back? So yeah, we can move on from this one. This standard, the following required elements shall be included as part of the form and massing of buildings: symmetrical organization of compositional elements, porches and balconies, prominent roof form, windows and doors that emphasize vertical orientation. Somewhat objective, very subjective, somewhat subjective, kind of somewhere in the middle, which leads me to believe it's not quite objective enough if we're getting different opinions. And I'll just kind of point out here, what are the compositional elements? What does a prominent roof form look like? Those are things that I think once you start to apply the standard may start to break down. Of course, in this context, like I said, we're cherry picking the standard, so maybe there's more information in the context surrounding this standard here. So let's move on to the next one. Walls visible from a public right-of-way shall not run in a continuous horizontal plane for more than 40 feet without incorporating articulating features such as clearly defined projecting or recessed architectural elements. All right, so what do you all think? Somewhat objective, very objective. So this one's more objective than I think some of the others we've seen based on the responses you provided. I think my question would be, what constitutes a clearly defined projecting or recessed architectural element? It kind of gets into the territory of Carla where, they say do this thing, but don't necessarily say what that is. So I think there's more needed to make this truly objective, in my opinion. And I would say I'm a reasonable person.
I'm probably going to disagree with you, which means it's not.
Yeah, there you go. So here, I think this is our last one. Except for pocket parks and multi-use paths and trails, common recreational spaces shall be continuous space with no less than 15 feet in any given direction. Very objective, somewhat objective, somewhat subjective. Yeah, I think I would agree with consensus here. Pretty darn objective. Let's move on. We're going to pause for discussion and questions. If anyone has any questions about any of the information presented, wants to raise a different issue that you're dealing with, now is a good time to do that. If you have any thoughts on some of the standards that we presented and why you think they're objective or subjective and want to talk about that, we'd love to hear from you. Anybody have any burning questions or comments? Seeing none. Going once, going twice, going 3 times. If anything comes up, feel free to put it in the chat and we can pause at the end as well. At this point, let's transition to our case study from the city of Carlsbad, and let's hear from Shelley. So hello, Shelley.
Hi, thanks everyone for having me. Again, my name is Shelley Glennon with the City of Carlsbad. I'm an associate planner working under the Community Development Department and also the project manager for the recently adopted objective design standards. So let me share my screen. I know how. Let's see. Okay, can you see my screen? I just want to confirm.
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so as I just mentioned, the city recently adopted two objective design standards, which include the citywide objective design standards project. This applies to all eligible multifamily housing and mixed-use development projects within the city boundaries, except for the village and barrio master plan area. As directed by City Council, the city processed a separate objective design standards project for the village and barrio, the city's two oldest neighborhoods, in order to include the development of a palette of architectural styles and the formation of a citizens design review committee to assist in the development of the village and barrio standards, which I'll discuss in further detail in this presentation. Both projects are intended to implement the city's recently certified housing element under Housing Element Program 1.11 objective design standards, and therefore it is required in order to stay compliant with the recently approved housing element. Okay, for the citywide project, the city prepared objective design standards manual. This is a standalone document that is incorporated by reference into the new zoning ordinance chapter. The manual is organized into 6 sections as shown here. The introduction section covers kind of the purpose and intent of the standards and implementation requirements. The site design standards address site layout, building placement, vehicle surface parking and access, pedestrian circulation and access, as well as private and common recreational space and landscaping. The building design standards include standards related to building massing, form, and articulation, including building entrances, window treatments, and color material. Section 4 includes additional mixed-use standards. These include standards that address both vertical and horizontal mixed use. Section 5, which is the utilitarian design standards. This addresses many different topics, which are considered small elements, but are present in nearly every housing development, such as equipment and utility screening, fences and walls, and lighting. And the last section includes definitions, and this obviously includes clearly defined terms, and which is necessary in order for these standards to be objective. Okay. As for the village and barrio standards, these standards were incorporated into the village and barrio master plan as a new appendix. So as previously mentioned, the City Council directed staff to develop a palette of architectural styles within the village and barrio objective design standards project. The 7 styles were selected, and they include the Spanish Revival, Craftsman, American Mercantile, Victorian, Colonial Revival, Cape Cod, Traditional Modern, and California Contemporary. These styles were developed with input from the community and in collaboration with the Citizens Design Review Committee. The range of architectural styles provide a palette that reflects the diverse and eclectic character of the village and barrio neighborhoods. Okay, as part of the citywide project, staff recommended edits to City Council Policy 44, Neighborhood Architectural Design Guidelines, and to rescind Policy 66, the Development of Livable Neighborhoods. These modifications to the policies shown here were recommended to remove outdated, subjective, and/or conflicting standards. So in coordination with the city's communication and engagement department, staff developed a comprehensive community outreach plan for both projects. For the Village and Barrio project, staff received input from the community through a community workshop held at the Senior Center in the barrio, as well as a public survey primarily to receive comments on the palette of architectural styles. Public comments were also requested during the public review period of the draft standards. And lastly, staff did reach out to the development community and met with a few developers to discuss the draft documents and receive their comments and input. For the citywide project, the community outreach process was less robust since there were no architectural styles included. Community input was gathered through the public review of the draft document, as well as through an online webinar to inform the public of what the project is and to receive their comments that way. Similar to the Village and Barrio project, staff also met with developers to receive their comments and questions related to the draft document. The city maintained a steady stream of information about the development of objective design standards and opportunities for public involvement. This included sending newsletters to more than 16,000 people, sharing information on the city's social media channels, the Nextdoor app, and publishing information on the city's website. As previously mentioned, the City Council appointed a design review committee to review the Village and Barrio project. The committee met 4 times within an approximate 1-year time frame to review the project, including draft documents and input that we received from the community. These meetings were open to the public, and notifications of the meetings were also provided through the different forms of media that I just discussed. At the last committee meeting, the Design Review Committee did recommend that the City Council approve the Village and Barrio standards. And in July of this year, Planning Commission also unanimously recommended that the City Council approve both objective design standard projects. So in conclusion, and kind of the message that staff drove throughout the entire public review process, is that the goals of the objective design standards is to help strengthen local design regulations, since the city currently cannot enforce existing subjective design guidelines for eligible projects, to ensure project compatibility with the existing community character, reduce project costs and long review timelines through implementing standards that provide developers clear direction, thereby creating a sense of predictability. And lastly, to encourage residential construction for both affordable and market rate units by creating objective standards that are appropriate in meeting the city's affordable housing needs and feasible in implementing the city's allowed densities. It is also important to note that these objective design standards are considered a starting point to ensure that the city has standards in place for new projects starting this year in compliance with both state and local requirements. These standards will be reviewed regularly and updated as deemed necessary. So to approve the citywide project, City Council took action on 4 items. They adopted by ordinance the citywide objective standards. They also adopted a resolution to approve a local coastal program amendment as needed to update the local coastal program implementation plan, which is a zoning ordinance. They also adopted 2 additional resolutions to amend the City Council policy and rescind the other policy as previously discussed in order to remove outdated and subjective and/or conflicting standards. For the Village and Barrio project, City Council took action on 2 items. They adopted by ordinance an amendment to the Village and Barrio Master Plan, and as well as a resolution approving a local coastal program amendment in order to update the local coastal program implementation plan for the Village and Barrio Master Plan area. Okay, that concludes my presentation. I am available for questions. Thanks.
Oh, thank you,
Sorry.
Shelley.
Sorry, that was it.
Appreciate the presentation, and I will turn it over to all of our attendees to see if anyone has any questions. Yeah.
I do have a question.
Go ahead.
For Shelley, thank you so much for the overview. I was wondering if it's possible to go a little bit into greater detail on the additional mixed use standards that were developed and with the city of San Diego, and that's something that we're kind of currently evaluating, and we're thinking of approaching, this through developing standards for the first 2 floors. But curious to hear what you all did.
Yeah, we for the citywide project, we definitely tried to keep it very simple, and not too complex with regards to mixed use. So I'll actually just kind of go through it with you. I could share my screen again. So yeah, as I mentioned, we categorized it by vertical mixed use and horizontal mixed use. So it's very, just kind of straightforward. We had ground floor use and activity, mostly, dealing, because, we were concerned about pedestrian views. So I think that was kind of the main issue. So a lot of it was regarding ground floor. So we have that for the vertical mixed use. We talk about ground, transparency in the windows, product displays, pedestrian scale. So that was very important for us to include. And then for horizontal, again, horizontal, obviously we're separating the residential uses from the commercial uses, but they're all on one site. So it was really just about site design and pedestrian circulation, access to common recreational space, and loading and service areas. So yeah, we kept it very simple. Again, I think by doing that allows for more flexibility, but still ensure that the intent of, creating pedestrian scale development was important for us.
Thank you.
Shelley, we have another question in the chat, and I'll read it out loud just so everyone can hear it. And it says, I believe one of the slides showed that the City Council did not vote unanimously in favor of adopting the design standards. What were some of the issues of concerns raised by the City Council?
Actually, the City Council did unanimously approve the objective design standards, as well as the Planning Commission. It was a design review committee. They were kind of almost split, I guess you can say, for the Village and Barrio objective design standards. The issue was, so the Village and Barrio, as I noted, there were, we included a palette of architectural styles. And while 7 styles were chosen, not all 7 styles were allowed in each of the Village and Barrio sub-districts. Developers were limited to the style and building type combination allowed in each sub-district. The 2 styles, there's 2 styles, I'll share my screen again, sorry. So there were 2 styles that some committee members did not want in the village center. It was the contemporary California, and then the traditional modern. They thought that those 2 were these styles were very common in the village center. So they didn't really see that being, they didn't want that, basically in this center anymore. And they wanted the other styles to be more prominent. So I think that was one of the, discussions, a conflict between the design review committee members. But as I mentioned earlier, not all, they are subject to specific requirements. So we made sure that the development standards or the design standards, sorry, of these two styles in particular were more prescriptive, and to ensure that they, that the developers would ensure that these buildings would be built, to the standards that that the city wanted, so that they fit in with the community character, and weren't dumbed down by, less design. So I think that's kind of how we address that.
I have a quick follow-up on that. Were there other topics that were particularly challenging for you to address as you were developing the objective design standards, or other topics that the design review committee paid specific attention to?
I think definitely the process was something we really had to talk a lot about, what projects are eligible and what projects are not. And I think that's where we really try to put that information in the introduction of each of these standards, kind of nailing down, what projects are eligible, how do we address conflicting standards. We also, in order to provide flexibility, we do allow for an optional waiver process, where applicants can waive up to 4 standards if they meet the findings. So there are a lot of things like that that were discussed, and I think that was important to have included as part of these standards.
Thank you. And we've got one more question in the chat, which is, has the city obtained certification of the LCPA, the Local Coastal Plan Amendment from the California Coastal Commission yet? If so, did the Coastal Commission staff attempt to insert any additional policy language into the city's documents?
Oh, no, we are still currently in the process of submitting our application. So we plan to submit this month. But we do meet regularly with Coastal Commission staff, so they are aware of this project coming to them. And obviously they were notified through the LCPA process as well. So yeah, we have not received comments yet. So.
Right. Well, I think there will be some great interest from neighboring jurisdictions in how that goes.
Yes, I will keep you updated.
Shelley. All right, well, if no other questions for Shelley at this time, we can keep moving. I think our next section is on implementation options, and I'll turn it back to Christine.
Right, thank you. Next slide. So we've summarized a variety of options to implement design standards. At the bare minimum, you can rely on existing regulations and be compliant with this requirement. So your code likely has development standards such as lot size, building height, setbacks, floor area ratio, and other criteria that regulate maximum building envelope. So that does comply. Another good technique is to look at revising your existing design guidelines. You can do a comprehensive update of design guidelines, but it can be more onerous than you might think when starting the process. So we just emphasize that it's not just a find and replace. Do need to look really comprehensively at both the criteria and also the administrative sections in regards to intent, applicability, any waivers or consistency and that sort of thing. But you can look at removing and rephrasing language and incorporating new requirements and also adopting as regulations, because sometimes design guidelines have not been adopted in such a way that they have that enforceability that we're looking for here. And then I think that what we are seeing more often is creating new objective design standards or expanding existing regulations. So creating a new package, be it as standalone design standards that then get referenced in your code, or they can be adopted through adoption with a specific plan or a master plan or another area plan. This can be a really good process. I think with any kind of design standards, it's also helpful to codify informal requirements. So your design review board, your planning commission, or other entities may have had a certain process or requirements that they are looking for. So it can be very helpful to codify that and just be very specific about and just giving the options to continue to regulate those topics in new regulations. Next slide. Our team developed an objective design standards toolkit for HCD, which many of you may have seen, but we did meet with HCD and get their feedback and direction through the process. And I think some of the biggest lessons learned from those conversations were to really focus on what matters here. Depending on the area that you are looking to regulate, the size of your city, the interests of your community, it can be a really complex undertaking to establish design standards. So their advice was really to keep it simple and concise, avoid really restricting or regulating things that are overly nuanced, overly stylized. If it's not going to make a big difference at the end of the day, the recommendation is to really focus on what will matter in terms of community character. Unless you have a very specific historical reason for doing so, sometimes it's just not, it's going to be hard to get that control of every last detail that you could if you were working with design guidelines. And, you know, again, considering the size of an applicability, you may not want to be so rigid across such a large area in terms of those standards. So another thing that's come up really is with the legislation, the wording is, you know, a little tricky. You know, our design guidelines still enforceable, regardless of the nuance in legislation. Again, what we're hearing is that you really should be avoiding design guidelines at this stage. It's just best practice to be really clear about what you are looking for, be objective, ensure that everyone around the table has the same interpretation. You can add guidelines to the design standards, but it can be tricky to do. If you're doing that, just, you know, make sure you label it as such and you're clear what is a design guideline. It's not enforceable, so it's helpful to have that label so it's clear which ones are required and which aren't. And then if you're adding design guidelines, it's a good idea to use them sparingly so that it's not confusing and there's no conflict between things that are required and things that aren't. Next slide. All right, well, this all comes down to community character. I think you've heard varying you know, feedback, and Shelley, thank you for your for diving deep into the process that you had with your community. It's great to engage the community. I think really listening to their needs. Again, it's going to be different everywhere, but if we can really kind of hone in on what they're looking for, what matters most to them, so that we can shape and refine the standards accordingly, that process can just be very helpful. These are some community survey topics, I think, as specific as we can be in terms of defining, again, how to regulate character. Things that become important are height transitions, architectural features and styles that are meaningful within a certain district. A lot of emphasis sometimes on building frontages, active frontages, non-residential uses that are part of residential use, residential buildings or mixed use. And then finally, open space in the public realm, those can be really key to engaging in more depth with the community. Next slide. So again, with an emphasis on priorities, it can be helpful just to take stock, given the feedback. What are your priorities? What we hear is really this list on the left side, goals of minimizing bulk, addressing transitions between density and less dense or more historic communities, really a focus on high quality development, articulation, active and vibrant spaces and places, walkability, open space, and then finally flexibility. Those are often the priorities, but just honing in on that and then keep coming back to that so you can narrow, just ensure that the standards are in fact achieving goals that you've set forth as priorities. And then, at the opposite side of that, really consider what you are looking to avoid. Again, it's often bulky, boxy, unarticulated, incompatible, blank walls, dead spaces. So these are things to emphasize how to avoid that, how to treat these places and spaces so that you are getting high quality. And then finally, ugly, that keeps coming up again and again, but that's very subjective, right? So it can take some pressing to figure out, well, what are you looking for? Next slide. So I think this is really kind of reiterating the points on the previous slides and where to focus the standards again. Don't try to accomplish everything with really long and onerous standards. They can create kind of a chilling effect if they're not achievable. So focus where it's going to matter. Next slide. Oh, and then we have a few examples. These are some of the last slides here for this topic. We are putting together some resource materials, and part of that will be a range of examples. So we have 4 here, starting with the City of San Diego's Grant Bill CPAWS. This was completed, I want to say about 10 years ago as part of a focus plan update for the Navajo community. So this is the community plan implementation overlay zone. So it wasn't objective design standards per se, it predated, but we think this is a really great example of objective design standards and the things that, again, they really focus on what matters, things like block lengths, curb cuts, connectivity, sidewalk improvements, ground floor design, building articulation. And so on the left is an example from a page in that document. And then these 2 photos show what the existing conditions were, what they were trying to regulate, and on the right, the improvements that were done as a result of the standards. Next slide. This is an example from Sunnyvale. They've recently adopted their citywide objective design standards. If you're interested in a point value system, this is a really interesting package to look at. They have a lot of this document is really regulated through the use of tables and point values for things like open space and frontage design. So again, you have flexibility, but there's a minimum quality and a lot of flexibility in terms of how to achieve quality. So again, if you're looking at avoiding rigidity and sameness, this can be a really nice way to go, these lists and point value systems. Next slide. And then this is Temecula's objective design standards. This is a great example of regulating style. It's very rich in terms of photography and graphic examples, but similar to the last example, it goes through a variety of styles and then shows what components make that style authentic and give a range of options. So that's a good example of style is important in the community. Next slide. All right, I think this is the last one. This is San Jose, their citywide design standards. This is a very detail-oriented document. So if you're really interested in architectural detail and regulating a much finer grain of design, this is a really nice example. The other thing I like about it is that it basically works as cut sheets where every topic is regulated through one page or at the most a spread. So it just helps to separate out issues and avoid having to kind of flip back and forth. They do provide standards and guidelines, but it's very careful, standards are come first and they're clearly articulated as such, and then guidelines follow. And they also include references to other city standards throughout as well. So some nice annotation as well that can be very helpful in interpretation. I think that's our last slide here. Questions?
Yeah, so that wraps up our presentation for today. We have some time for discussion and questions. If you have any of those, I have some notes here from our Slido poll on what you all wanted to hear about. And I think we've kind of got some maybe some outstanding questions from that. I don't know who asked the fire mitigation question and whether we sufficiently answered that through Gabrielle's presentation and what exemptions may be available for standards. So I think we checked the box on that, but if you want to know more, now is a good time to chime in. The other question I wrote down is about large jurisdictions. So I think we heard a little bit from Carlsbad, how they approached with kind of a base set of standards citywide and drilling down on their village and barrio areas with more robust standards. So I think that's a good model. San Jose may be another good place to look. And I don't know if anyone else has any other ideas, but I think we've answered that. Let me know if we need to talk more about that. And then I think the big one, the hard one, is measuring effectiveness. I don't know how to answer that, open to discussion, but I think the example from Grantville is a good example of before and after conditions. And I think that's really what we're all hoping to see is transformation in the built environment and projects that enhance the public realm. And so the proof is really in the pudding there, and do your standards work. So I know Carlsbad is only a few months into their standards, but I'm looking forward to seeing how that's applied to projects as well as others that are coming and in progress or recently adopted. So I see a hand raised from Margaret. So I don't know if you're able to unmute yourself, Margaret, but if you have a question or would like to chime in, please do so.
Yeah, I had the fire question. And so where that's coming from is, it was our understanding that if your project is in a high fire zone, you would not qualify for ODS. But the way that one of the legislative pieces is written is that if the applicant can comply with state fire mitigation regulations, then they could qualify. And so we're trying to figure out, has anyone encountered this and written that into their code, or found out exactly what state mitigation recommendations they're referring to in that part of the law?
Gabrielle, I don't know if you caught that. You may be in the best position to answer that.
Yes, I guess I'm not quite following which law you're referring to, or why these projects would not be subject to objective design standards. Objective design standards would apply to all of your housing projects, well, all projects, unless there's an exemption or a reason to not apply them. So I guess I'm not totally clear on what you're getting at with the fire standards.
I think I'd have to go back and figure out exactly which bill it was I was reading this from. It might have been 2011, which it seemed like didn't apply to high fire zones.
Okay. And that's the bill dealing with residential and commercial zones.
Yeah.
Okay, so it might be in that particular context and not necessarily applicable throughout. But yeah, I'm not quite sure what specifically you're getting at. So
that'd be my guess too, because SB 35 has that list of criteria that makes projects ineligible, which includes very high fire hazard severity zones. SB 6 builds right off of that as well. And I think one of the things that makes objective design standards difficult to talk about is their close relationship to SB 35, SB 330, AB 2011, SB 6, and the eligibility for all of those streamlining bills as well. So there is some overlap and confusion between that, I think.
Yeah, I think at the county, we're trying to implement all of those. We're trying to incorporate a lot of those bills together in our ODS project. And I think that's complicated things a bit.
Agree. I would imagine that's a complicated thing to take on all at once, but you know, maybe one approach would be kind of what Carlsbad did, of a base set of regulations and then tailoring to specific areas, if that's an option for you all.
I have a question.
Yeah,
So my question was around implementation, and I am personally struggling with the fact that, like, well, I guess deciding what would be the right approach for implementation, whether reviewing our current zoning standards from our zoning code or overlay zones or specific plans, or developing an overarching document like Carlsbad did. And I'm conflicted internally, like personally, just because I feel like creating a whole document just creates another layer for developers to look into. So it's like, not only do they have to look at the zoning code, but they have to look at the specific plan and then something else and now this. And so I personally think that like opening up every single one is like a good option to review just the certain specific policies and then update them to be objective. That's also a lot of work. I'm only one person. I cannot do it on my own. So how have different jurisdictions, or you from your experience, kind of like figured out what the right implementation path would be depending on what you want to do?
Yeah, go ahead.
That's a really great question. I think that it's always good to look comprehensively at all of your guiding regulations. So I'd advise to do that, see where you're strong, where there may be gaps or weaknesses, or where you're getting applications that, you know, maybe they're proposing something that you don't want to see, or you're spending a lot of time on certain issues. I start there. And then it definitely needs to be a phased approach, but one thing I would caution against is having citywide design standards and then having design standards in multiple specific plans that maybe are not in sync. I would advise having your standards be applicable to certain areas, and then having the specific plans offer the guidance for those specific areas, because those have been studied in great detail already. So where it starts to be really complicated and cumbersome is when you have both, and both are in effect. So that's my preference. I don't know if that answers your question.
I'll just offer my perspective, which is I don't know how you can do this without looking at your existing regulations. If you're using those to regulate development, you ought to look at them, because you know, we titled this workshop Objective Design Standards, but that really is a misnomer. Like, it should just be objective standards. We're talking about a lot more than design. We're talking about subdivision, landscaping, and all of those need to be objective as well if they're coming into play. And one example of that may be some of your use permissions for multifamily, for example, which could be conditioned upon sensitive transition to an adjacent single family zone. So that's not uncommon in a zoning code. And if that's like your allowable use framework, that in and of itself is not objective. So I think starting there is a necessary thing. But obviously I think you're getting at more of the design aspect and bulk and massing and how to break that up. And then I would turn to kind of Christine's advice, but I think starting at the beginning is necessary as well. Anyone else have any other thoughts on approaching your existing regulatory framework and how to adapt that to an objective one?
I have a comment. Sorry, Shelley with the City of Carlsbad. Sorry. Yeah, so for our projects, we did have to, for the citywide project, we had to do an extensive review of all our existing standards, city codes, master plans, specific plans. In the end, we determined there were only really 2 design documents that applied citywide. And those were the 2 documents we ended up amending or rescinding, which I discussed in the presentation. But other than the Village and Barrio Master Plan, the other master plan specific plans, we decided not to amend. Instead, we tried to ensure that this citywide manual would replace many of the subjective standards that were frequently included in the existing master plans and specific plans that can no longer be implemented. But as far as if there were conflicting standards, we did have a conflicting standard clause, which states that, you know, if there's a conflicting standard in this manual with the standard in the existing specific plan or master plan, the master plan or specific plan standard would prevail. I think legally that was the best route to take. If we need to amend any of the master plans or specific plans later on, we probably would look into that. But as of right now, that's not, we didn't amend any of the existing master plans or specific plans.
Shelley, before you go away, I think one related question and something I noticed in your effort was your actual ordinance and your changes to your municipal code. It looks like you adopted the guidelines by reference in there, which you know, gives you kind of the enforceability of a regulation, but allows some flexibility to update those slightly easier. Is that true? Did I mischaracterize that, or how did you approach that?
Well, no, it's if we do have to amend the manual, we still have to go through the full review process, because once it's, you know, included by reference, it's codified, so that manual is codified. But the reason why we did that was I don't know, I think our ordinance is kind of old school. We don't have a lot of graphics in our ordinance. It's mostly text. So in order to include, like, you know, robust graphics, we had to include it by reference. So that's what we did.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I can add a little bit.
Yeah.
So, hi everybody, this is Sarah Toma. I was actually the project manager for the City of Temecula's objective design standards. And then one way, just to maybe help Scylla, so the way we started that project was we definitely looked at, like, just the starting out point. We looked at the design guidelines, the city design guidelines. And I basically just made a quick outline of it. And then I shared it with the planners and got their feedback, because they were the current planners, and they provided that feedback of like what they focus on mainly when they do project reviews. And then from there, we did, we selected a style of whatever that was, architectural style of what's important for the city and what they wanted basically to see. And then once we created the list of those styles, it was basically compiling everything together, and then making it objective as possible, obviously with legal help. So I would highly recommend including them kind of in the beginning of the process, because they can weed out a lot of the stuff that maybe as planners we think, oh, this is important, we want this, where legal is like, I don't know how to defend this, you can't have that there. And also I'd like to point out what's important. I know a lot of this stuff falls on planning division or planning department, or community development, but this was definitely a labor of love with all different departments, public works, fire, building. We included a lot of outside agencies as well as part of our review. Some didn't respond. We sent them the drafts, didn't respond, that's fine, but we did our due diligence. I think that's important because there is the implementation component, like once it's adopted and you actually have to put it, you know, on the ground. In current planning, you know, as you know, it's a different world. and what actually can be adopted or can be enforced, especially from the planner who's reviewing it. Another approach that we did was it's a checklist, like the document itself, if you look at it online, it's a checklist. So we wanted to make it easy for the planner as well as for the developer who's proposing and using some SB, whatever number that they want to build. We wanted to make a quick checklist, like, yep, you got this, you picked this specific architectural style. And so it's also documented and can be implemented quickly. So that was also another, hopefully that's helpful.
Super. I was actually going to ask you or Shelley about the collaboration between departments, because that was something that I think about when you look at these ODS kind of like policies where like you can only or you will have this setback so you don't have a wall. I can't say them exactly, but yeah, like these regulations, I can imagine, for example, our city building officer like pulling on a hair for, you know, certain limitations that buildings face. Because sometimes it does mess with the structural integrity.
Yes.
So, did you have any pushback for certain standards?
Yes, absolutely. It was, again, it was a labor of love because you have to kind of, whether you have to work with them and they, especially with building, they have a specific set of standards.
Yeah.
They don't have a kind of how planners are like, oh, well, I'd like to have, you know, stuff that matches the other stuff. And they're like, we don't know what that means. Like, give us specific code. So you just have to work with internally with your departments. I personally leaned a little bit more on like my director and supervisor because they were able to kind of leverage and give me almost like quote unquote the authority to have them respond on specific things that we needed. So like whatever you draft, you can say like, hey, fire department, for example, I need you to look at this specific thing and only that, because when you send them the whole document, they're like, I don't want to look at it, you know, I don't have time. So I think that's helpful too. But it definitely takes coordination. But I don't know if Shelley, she's done it more recently. I'm a little bit couple years back, so maybe she can provide some guidance on that.
Yeah, we definitely we needed to do a lot of coordination and preparation for both projects. So we had a design review team look at the draft standards. So that included all the different departments, land development, engineering, transportation, fire, building. And then, you know, we also met with the current planning team, the ones, you know, the planners that actually work with the applicants to implement these standards. So we wanted to get their input as well. We also coordinated with management in getting their feedback on not just the standards, but also the process. So yeah, definitely there's a lot of coordination required. So a lot of planning as far as making sure that you're on schedule, you know, is really important to get the project done.
I recommend having that, like Shelley said, I recommend having that team, internal team, so then everybody knows what they're here for at that meeting, because that helps make things a little easier for you as a project.
Any other questions?
I just had a question for Shelley too. I'm curious, were there any forms of public engagement or any types of public engagement that were particularly fruitful while you were developing the standards?
That were what? Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Like particularly like helpful or fruitful?
Oh, you know, I think, you know, yeah, I believe like the committee, I think, was really helpful in the village and barrio standard and developing the palette of architectural styles, because, you know, I think we would have probably went a different way if we didn't have a design review committee. So I thought, you know, their comments were very helpful in getting the variety of styles to be included in the village and barrio standards. And, you know, they also participated in the community outreach efforts. So for example, at the workshop, the committee members were there and they were also answering questions to the public and including staff. So it was really great to have them, you know, really be part of that process and help us kind of get the comments we need in order to develop these standards.
Anyone else online have any questions? All right. I think we had some questions to foster discussion. What building typologies are most important to address through objective design standards? Obviously, we're talking about multifamily, but we did hear a lot about mixed use. I'll leave that on the table if anyone feels inclined to answer it. If there's any other building typologies that you're struggling with or important to your community, kind of oddball project types or unique conditions may come into play here. Is it important to regulate architectural styles and features in your community? I think we've heard a lot of discussion on that today. So I don't know if anyone else feels like it might not be, or if there are other styles that may come into play. But that was one question we were hoping to discuss today, and I think we did hear some about that. And then what other topics are most important in your community? And again, I'll leave that on the table as well. So any other questions or comments from anyone before we wrap up here? All right, let's head towards wrap up then, and we'll go to the next slide. Just wanted to give you all a sense of what's next for the SANDAG HAP TA program. Do you want to cover this, or would you like me to?
I can kind of cover some of it, and then if I miss anything,
sure.
you can kind of follow up. So the first bullet here I'll touch on is the staffing assistance. So everyone likely on this call or in the kind of the TA email list should have received a notice that the deadline to submit requests to the TA was last week on Friday. So as for now, we're no longer accepting requests through the staffing assistance. We're kind of, setting our workload for the remainder of this program. However, if you have a burning request, you meant to reach out last week, or if there's something you want to kind of bring to our attention, please go ahead and shoot us an email as soon as possible. And we'll go ahead and address it on a case-by-case basis. And then kind of with that is the legislation tracking. We kind of covered this through a webinar previously, and some documents we're just kind of tracking the legislation. But at this point, I believe was the deadline on the 14th for the governor to sign all the bills. So we'll be sending out kind of a more updated version of that list with where everything landed. However, we did kind of want to touch on, that brings us to the next point is, on November 30th, we're going to be holding a joint legislative webinar with the Association of Bay Area Governments. And so we're going to kind of have a large virtual webinar kind of going over all of the key housing and land use bills that have been passed and signed by the governor. So that's a good one to look out for. I will include a registration link for that in the follow-up to this, but I have sent one out previously, but go ahead and sign up for that when I share it. Other regional trainings that we're just kind of planning out on the horizon for everyone just to kind of keep an eye out for is kind of later this year, a housing rehabilitation programs forum. This has been requested from a couple jurisdictions, a little bit more information here. So we're going to kind of turn it into a webinar forum style training to kind of touch base on some of these things. So yeah, you can look forward to that. And then in early 2024, we're going to kind of have two forums we have set on the horizon, which is one for pro housing for anyone interested in learning more about that. If you're going through the application yourself, or want to hear about any changes that might have come from the legislation, keep an eye out for that, as well as APR office hours. We hosted those this year as well, but with the APRs being due April, I believe, of next year, that'll be a timely one to kind of come to, whether you've done this many times or you may be new to it. We kind of hold office hours to meet with our team one-on-one to kind of talk through any questions or concerns. As always, though, if anyone has ideas for regional trainings or something they might want a webinar held on, please share that with us, and we can see how we can work that into some of the TA program. So yeah, just keep an eye out for those kind of things. And then I'll let you touch on the templates and toolkits.
Yeah, before I get there, I just wanted to go back to legislation. Apologize for the overlap for anyone who did want to attend APA California Legislative Update webinar. It was at 11 today and went into this. So we already rescheduled this, recognized the conflict, and proceeded ahead as to avoid delays. So apologies for any conflicts. That should be recorded. But I also wanted to mention, we've had a couple legislative updates throughout the legislative session. We've been tracking pieces of legislation that have been pending that you all have been suggesting to us. There are a number of bills that didn't pass this year or have been made 2-year bills. So we're looking at updating our tracking document just so you can see the outcome of the bills we've been tracking, includes noted changes that happened during the legislative process. So that will be a little bit of a different resource than you may find elsewhere. So I wanted to mention that. And then in terms of templates and toolkits that are forthcoming, out of this training, we'll be developing a FAQ document on objective design standards, distributing a library of links and resources to examples with some notes on why those are helpful examples, and instead of just sending a bunch of links. And then we're trying to pull together a toolkit as well to give people a starting point for objective design standards. I know we've talked with many of you about objective design standards in the past, but if you have other ideas on what might make that helpful and get you moving on objective design standards, if you're working on an effort, please let us know, and we'll happy to talk about that. We have also gotten a lot of requests out of housing elements for group homes, mobile homes, and the variety of group homes and the different flavors they come in. And I know a lot of you have programs to address that through your housing element. So we're looking at some best practices and some guidance around that topic as well. So that's what we have to look forward to. And I think really concludes our presentation for today. So thank you all for attending, and let's give a quick virtual round of applause for our speakers today, Gabrielle, Christine, and Shelley. Thank you all very much. And thank you all for attending.